Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. And we'll just be starting in another 60 seconds. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar. I'm Olutobi Akingbade. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela University. And I want to warmly welcome everyone for joining us for today's very important webinar. It is a topical issue we'll be looking at today, and we are glad to have you join us. And on behalf of the leadership of CANRAD, and on behalf of the research group at CANRAD, on behalf of the research group at CANRAD and the entire leadership of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, I welcome you to this very important webinar. Thank you once again for joining us. I will, without much ado, be introducing our guests for today. It's going to be a conversation between Professor Andreas Bozonot and Dr. Sandla Numbit. They are going to be in a conversation about this very topical issue that we are going to be looking at today. Professor Andreas Bozonot, he is an academic, he's a musician, he's a poet, and he is a visual artist. He's a professor of development studies at the University of Fort Hare in Alice. He is widely published. He has co-edited volumes, and he has published especially in the area of National Union of Mine Workers, and he currently has an ongoing research interest that looks into reshaping of mining and mining communities in South Africa. Welcome, Professor Andreas Bozonot. We are very glad to have you on board this morning. And of course, also on board this morning is Dr. Sandla Numbit. Dr. Sandla, he holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Pretoria. He works as an institutional researcher in Nelson Mandela University at NMU's Office for Institutional Strategy. Dr. Sandler's research interests lie broadly in the sociology of work, migrant labor, and higher education, with particular focus on student movements. Dr. Sandla Numbit and Professor Andreas Bozonot, if you can just come on now by switching on your camera. We're very happy to have you join us this morning. And to everyone, please, we want you to engage while the conversation is going on by putting in your comments and questions in the chat function. If you go down the screen, you're going to see the chat function there. So please don't wait till the end of the conversation while we're going to the Q&A. Before the Q&A, engage while the conversation is going on by letting us have your comments, your opinions, and your questions in the comment section. And also we are streaming this session live also on Facebook and YouTube, and we look forward to having questions also from these two platforms alongside those of us in this webinar here on Zoom. Over to you, Professor Andreas. Thank you once again, and thank you also, Dr. Sandler. Yeah.
Thank you, Olutobi, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you to CANRAD for organizing and hosting this conversation. The idea Sandla and I had was to use the platform and to not do a typical seminar style intervention, but to follow the kinds of interviews you have at book festivals around books and topics, and rather do a conversation than a formal seminar. So we would appreciate you participating in the conversation. For the first 45 minutes, we'll have a two-way conversation, but we'd be really happy if you contribute and ask questions using the comment and the chat function. So I have a number of questions prepared and around this research that Sandla's done and the concept of ina-ethe migration that is put on the table. and we'll be unpacking that in our conversation. But we would very much like it to be a conversation rather than a seminar style online discussion. Sandla, I want to start out with a sort of a vignette and a story to concretize what we're talking about today. So shortly after the Marikana massacre and those tragic events, you were commissioned to do field work by the monitoring and evaluation people in the presidency. And this field work took you to Mpondoland, where you did the research. And then later on, much later, after the Marikana incident, there was a long strike in 2014, where platinum workers got a significant wage increase. And you returned to Mpondoland, and there was a specific incident around the houses of mine workers that kind of illustrates, I think, part of the story that you're telling. So I was wondering if you could maybe relate that and give us a bit of detail on that, or the conversation you had with the mine worker there, and what it says about how our society has changed since Marikana up to now.
Okay, thank you, Andres, and thank you so much to Prof. Christopher van der Stezen for inviting us, to have this conversation. It's such a pleasure to be here and to get a platform really that offers an opportunity to reflect on some of of the events of my entire PhD journey, as well as to some of the projects that you just alluded to. So in actual fact, if my recollection serves me right, Andres, it was actually in 2014 when I did that visit. Because if I remember correctly, at this point, it is when that I found mine workers at home. And I remember, I think at the time I visited there, it was probably around the 4th month, of the 2014, wage strike. And, part of the revisit, being deployed there fundamentally was based on trying to understand some of the conditions, one, that led, to the 2012 events of Marikana. Secondly, it was also to try and find out what is it that actually drives mine workers to stay away from work and sacrificing a wage for such a prolonged period. And it was an excellent experience because, visiting Lusikisiki first, which is one of the former and current actually labor sending areas to the mines. It actually exposed me, to the lived conditions, of migrant workers and their families. And, the picture then was not good. And this was in 2014. People, although they worked really hard, they still were not able, to point out to certain returns, for their labor, to the mines. Much as they were appreciative of the wages, it still was not shown, in terms of, material conditions, and what they could actually be able to do for their families. So during that period of having been sent, then to the work, I got into conversations with mine workers. I got into conversations with the wives of mine workers and got some, in-depth understanding of what was actually happening in the migrant household. Following which, in 2017, when I returned to do field work, conditions had improved immensely. In terms of, the housing structures, utilities, and other amenities within the household had changed. I remember this one incident where this woman, who is a wife and partner to a mine worker, said to me, "Look, let's take a walk. Let's go stand just, behind the fence ahead of us. And I just want to point out to you what has changed." And one of the illustrations she made, she said, you remember when you first came here, we had that two-roomed flat and just one Jojo tank, but post the events of Marikana and the strike of 2014, things have increased incredibly. I mean, have improved incredibly, such that if you look at my house, it looks exactly like that of a teacher's house, and she went on to say, I now have a flat screen television inside the house, as you have seen. I now have another Jojo tank. My house has been extended. Finally, I can see what it is that my husband is absent for the larger part of the year. So those were some of the experiences, and I think that is actually where the genesis of my work came from. It was actually the events of the period of 2014 that actually began to give me a sense of it's important to understand post-apartheid migrant labor patterns to the minds.
Thanks for that. I think it puts an interesting vignette on the table that illustrates what you're trying to say with this notion of ina-ethe migration. So in a way, ina-ethe migration, you're arguing, has replaced the old system of what people used to call cheap labor power, following Harold Wolpe's essay from the 1970s. Can I ask you to expand a little bit on this notion of ina-ethe? Some of the people listening in will know the song. It's sort of the idea of give and take, maybe reciprocity, but if you can maybe just explain the concept. What do you mean with this idea of ina-ethe migration?
Okay. I think first and foremost, the most important thing, Andres, to think about is just that where does migrant labor come from? And as you've correctly pointed out, migrant labor before the democratic dispensation and during apartheid and the colonial regimes, it was underpinned by cheap wage labor, and it was underpinned by squalid living conditions for mine workers in the mines, and everything wrong, if I can put it like that. And when then I went back, to in 2017 to do research, it was actually the words that I uttered earlier, that emerged from this woman who said, you can see that things have changed. Now, it is understandable that my husband can be in the mine for the larger part of the year. And it was also what mine workers were telling me, that finally we see the value of our labor, and so by ina-ethe migration, Andres, what I mean is that I'm talking about a type of migration that, first and foremost, ina-ethe means give and take. It's an isiXhosa word for give and take, and in street language they will call it nika. You give me something, I give you something back. It's the essence really is founded on that. So it's a type of migration that is really underpinned by reciprocal relationships. Between, firstly, the migrant worker and his workplace, wherein the migrant gives off his labor, and then in return he's rewarded with better and improved wages. And it also speaks to the reciprocal relationships between the migrant worker and the household manager, who in the traditional household is the wife, who, whilst the man works for hard cash in Rustenburg or in Western area, or wherever it could be, the wife is able to receive whatever it is that is remitted to the migrant household and take that and improve it, into something meaningful in the household by investing in some of the social economies that exist at community level. So in essence, what I mean by ina-ethe is that. But I think what is also important, to note is that all of this ina-ethe migrant labor at the household, ina-ethe at the household level, where you get at the household level, where you get reciprocal relations between the husband and the wife, also do exist within the constraints of patriarchy itself. It's not to say just because the household management relations have improved, it does not mean then that that is outside of the context of patriarchy.
Thank you for that. I mean, I assume primarily an academic audience listening. I want to preempt a question that I think a lot of people are asking themselves. You're making quite a controversial argument here, arguing that there has now been a move away from what Walpe used to call cheap labor power. Matunzwa used the notion of cheap labor power again in speeches. The incidents in Marikana put the whole issue of migrant labor on the agenda again. And you're making quite a radical argument, saying that we've now shifted to a different kind of migration where there's more reciprocity in that relationship and less exploitation maybe. What is your empirical evidence for this? Can you tell us a little bit about your field work? What you did in order to get to this argument? What is your evidence?
Okay. So I think, from the January of 2017 and 2016, I did field work in two locations of Ndageni, which is in Flagstaff, my home village, as well as Mtikana, which is in Lusikisiki, a few kilometers away from my own hometown. And I predominantly zoomed into two households, although I spoke with a bigger contingent of women who are migrants who are wives to migrants. And some of the things that in each household I would spend, I think I spent on each household a minimum, if not maximum, 3 months. And I got to observe, some of the developments that were happening, and some of the things that my participants alluded to is that for one, now I no longer, as a mother, have to worry about a child who's going back to university in January, because we know for a fact that the father can be able to put away certain amounts of money, unlike before, and ensure to a child's registration. Similarly, there were ongoing constructions in some households, some of which I saw, and all of that was beginning to say, although this type of money is not surplus, but now at least we can begin to save and rely less on issues of, and rely less on omashonisa, which are creditors. So it really at a fundamental level, those are some of the things that I saw, that people now could be able to take their children. I remember one mine worker was, alluded to the fact that his child is in a private school in Pietermaritzburg, and it's something that he took really a big pride on. And he even alluded to the fact that he hopes that, at some stage in this child's life, she too would be in the same position that I was in, of doing field work and trying to understand more, meaning that this child would have gone to university. So materially, there had been a lot of improvement, even in the quality of life, from the points of diet, and so on and so forth, things had, improved remarkably. There were cars, in households, things that, were not there before. And I think, having said that, we also appreciate that although there is this ina-ethe, even in that context, we cannot ignore the fact that there are still some other workers, in the mines who are subcontracted workers who aren't able, to speak ina-ethe, and hence we say it's a shift that exists within the parameters of continuities and discontinuities.
Okay, thank you. So basically, it's on the basis of ethnographic work and time you spent at both ends. In Mpondoland and in Rustenburg, you spent time in the households of mine workers, and I think you're making the last point you made as an interesting and an important one, because roughly a third of the workers, mine workers in the platinum industry, are employed through third parties, some kind of subcontractor. And these subcontracted workers are often excluded from the benefits that the more permanently employed workers have gained through the strike and through wage deals with mining houses.
Yes, look, I think you raise a very important point, because I think this is one unfortunate part really about my study, that I didn't get a very good sample of subcontracted workers so that I could speak to their conditions, and I think that challenges me, to, as maybe one thinks about the concept of a book going forward, they would want to revisit and actually look into those conditions, because from a handful of subcontracted workers that I spoke with, some of them did not even earn a third of what their fully employed colleagues were earning, and so the changes there are pretty much slow for that a cohort of workers.
Okay, so there's still that labor market segmentation there that introduces a caveat and some element of the past of the past regime.
Yes.
I want to, Sandla, I want to put the issue of gender theory on the table, because there's an interesting route that you followed in your PhD. You started out with a reading of the old kind of structuralist Marxist literature on the emergence of migrant labor, the dispossession of land in order to create a proletariat, the imposition of taxes, poll tax, in order to motivate workers to go to the mines to seek employment. So the entire migrant labor system was historically based on structures of force and dispossession. And it starts to change over time. There's a massive shift in 1975 when Malawi withdraws labor from the mining industry. Mozambique becomes independent. So things change over time, and wages also to some extent increase over time. But a lot of these perspectives on migrant labor in South Africa departs from quite structuralist Marxist understandings of society. And your study took you into gender theory and in a completely different direction, where you kind of came to the realization that these theories are too structuralist and that they're not dynamic enough. They don't focus on agency, and particularly the construction of femininities and masculinities. If you can maybe say a little bit about that theoretical journey, because in a way it's what you witnessed in the field that took you into gender theory, rather than an original interest in that. And I think it would be interesting for people attending to hear a little bit about that journey.
Yes. No, thanks, Andres. Yeah, look, I mean, I think this was the biggest curveball for me, in my PhD, because really I went, into the journey with a very structuralist approach, and of course this was based on my experience of Mpondoland, not having zoomed in. Now, if you think of Mpondoland, you think of towns such as Bizana, Flagstaff, Lusikisiki, Port St. John's, and I think Mpondo, and other areas that I might have missed out. These are areas that have historically provided, yes, migrant labor to the mines. And what's quite glaring about, those areas is lack of economic opportunities, and hence my approach was, basically my approach was trying to understand if in some ways lack of economic opportunities in Mpondoland actually, precipitates, migrant labor continuity. And fortunate enough for me, I started with fieldwork in Mpondoland, trying to understand, migrant labor continuity from the side of migrant workers' families, and their wives, and so what I found there fundamentally was that, among other things, although we cannot negate the economic reality of the underdevelopment of those areas or the slow development thereof, of the areas, at the center of migrant labor were women. Why women? Historically, I think we will all appreciate that women have traditionally played the role of homemaker. And, the patterns, however, during the course of my fieldwork, showed that women were central to migrant labor continuity because of some of the engagements that they're involved in at community level, a space that which I argue is better navigated by women because of their historic position. So in that space, I discovered that whether the husband is not a migrant worker or not, women were in actual fact in control of in charge of, family economics or family dynamics by ways of converting things such as social grants, old age grants into meaningful economic contributions into the family through what is called in Mpondoland, and I borrow from the area as imibuto. Now, imibuto others will call as stokvel, umholiswano, this and that. But I used the name, the notion of imibuto to highlight. Imibuto actually, in essence, it just means unions, right? And I use that word because it also underscores reciprocity, right? It underscores reciprocity. So when I got to the household, I actually found that women had actually moved from that traditional homemaker role to becoming active economic participants within the household based on how they manipulate the remittances, how they manipulate, social development grants into something that is meaningful. And in instances where men don't work, actually this becomes one of the factors that challenges hegemonic masculinity, such that men are able to are pushed in some ways to take up migrant labor, so that they can in some ways compete or contest their position as traditional leaders of households. So this is where, for me, the turning point was to say, actually, it does not suffice that I come only with, structural understandings of migrant labor continuity. So really the birth of what I refer to as a transformed type of, femininity speaks to this, where women have in some ways moved up, a step up from the traditional position of umama wekhaya, a homemaker, but to people that are actually managers of households and people who actually stand to an extent, in a platform that, you know, gives them voice, not just as a mother and a person who provides for care work, you know. And again, I need to stress this. All of this happens within, you know, the context of patriarchy, because even the move, you know, to Rustenburg by a man who does not work, you know, is a sign of a, for lack of a better term, is a sign of a person who, you know, whose position within the household is in some ways threatened, you know, in their patriarchal seat, such that they see it necessary, you know, to take up migrant labor. But also, Andrews, I think another point that is important to emphasize is that, you know, these men, whether married or not, whether with intentions of getting married or not, they find themselves in a position of taking up the one source of income that they're familiar with, in the absence of economic opportunities within you know, their whole Mpondoland area, and this is migrant labor. And I think this would be better understood through Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, where one actually, you know, when all else fails in the position, I mean, in the situation of Mpondo men, they track back to what they know, you know, because their grandfathers, their fathers, you know, have always taken up migrant labor to be, you know, in order for them to have a meaningful contribution in the household and also assert, you know, their manhood / masculinities.
Thank you, Sandla. There are a number of really interesting points being made in the chat function, but I'm not going to go there as yet. I still want to get more of your argument on the table, and I think then we can start responding to some of the really interesting points raised by, for example, Tumi Malope from Stellenbosch University and Gavin Hartford as well, who's also written on the topic. So. Colleagues, we'll get to your comments. Sandla, there's a really interesting additional shift or change that you've identified, and you spend a whole chapter on this. And this is the tendency or the trend for migrant mine workers to move their cattle from the Eastern Cape to Rustenburg. So, I mean, just to link this to your previous point, in a way, your understanding of the household challenges that idea of production in Rustenburg, reproduction in Mpondoland. The household is a unit of production. The household is an economic unit where all these economic activities are going on. And another shift that I find really interesting is now also where cattle farming used to happen back at home. This is now moved to Rustenburg. So it's another really interesting a trend, and I'd like you to expand a little bit, just concretely. What's happened with this thing of keeping cattle in Rustenburg rather than back home?
I think your colleagues who have read William Baynard's work will appreciate, you know, this shift very much, because I think William Baynard does, you know, some nascent work on you know, on Mpondos and keeping cattle, which is one of the reasons why Mpondo joined migrant labor to the mines much later, you know, after the discovery of minerals in South Africa. So they delayed because they were reaching cattle. However, I think what now I identified in Rustenburg was that increasingly, you know, migrants from Mpondoland, not only Mpondoland, in fact, Mpondoland, the Batembu, Amabomvana, and other, you know, men from the Eastern Cape tend to keep cattle there instead of buying, you know, inkomo in the Eastern Cape, you know, as it were. I remember growing up as a person who comes from a labor selling area, himself, and then would come back from Johannesburg or Rustenburg, get back to Endageni, and travel to Kokstad, which is a nearer a farming town, to our own hometown, and come back with the car, which would then multiply from that side, as opposed to Rustenburg. But this has fundamentally shifted, and here's why. Migrants in Rustenburg live around, Rustenburg in its own right is not only a mining town, but also a farming town. So the migrants have come to learn a lot, from local, farmers in Rustenburg, such that they began to start their own izibaya for purposes of making sure that, they're able to look after the cows themselves, right? Why cows? Because for them, cows are a currency. It's a form, they still identify traditionally with cattle as a form of wealth. Most of them believe that a man should bank in the crown as opposed to banking in the bank, only because, a cow is an almost guarantee that whatever it is that you may need your child to go back to school, you may need to go back to school, and you need registration money, you can take a cow and put it on the market, and therefore be able to afford fees. And they also believe that if your elderly son wants to get married, traditionally as a Mpondo man, you assist your son in being able to pay off lobola if you want. Instead of going to the bank to lend, you turn to what? To your investment. You draw out 2-3 cows and go submit them to your in-laws, to kickstart lobola negotiations and so on and so forth. So there've been, and of course, some of the issues are such that have led these men to keep cattle there is the appreciation that things have fundamentally shifted in rural areas, where either people work or refuse, or don't work because of lack of opportunities. But most importantly, in history, if you read some of Baynard's work, you'll find that it is children who actually took care of cattle. But now that has changed because most children these days are school going. So they believe they are the people who are best suited, to look after their cattle. And they have also adopted new ways of taking care of cattle. New ways in such that they are able to administer medicine. They are also able to administer medicine themselves, whereas such is not much of a thing back in Mpondoland. Really this also shows some type of a shift, because previously this is not something that would be welcome, because it also speaks to the relationship that mine workers have with local authorities and such as what you call traditional leaders in the space, because for them to be able to erect kraals in such a space, they would need to have spoken with local traditional leaders such that they can keep their cattle, and they also get certain lessons from that group of people.
Fascinating stuff. Sandla, you told a story about also the approach to farming cattle that has to do with breeding.
Yes.
Maybe tell a little bit more about that and the difference between, how's the
Okay.
There's an interesting vignette around someone telling you, look at these cattle. You won't tell the difference between this and the white farmer.
Yes. No, but I think I found that quite fascinating. Now, let me first tell a story of when I went to first audit the area before I actually moved in for field work in Rustenburg. I was with a friend of mine who was also a colleague at the University of Pretoria, having completed his master's there. And one of his responses were like, hey, Ntwana, who owns these cows? He's actually an animal scientist. That's what I'm missing. He actually asked me, my goodness, who owns these cows? And my first response was that it's probably a local Boreman. You know, they are very well fed. It must be someone who's quite familiar, with breeding, and all sorts of things that have to do with farming. To my surprise, a few weeks later, I discovered that, these cattle actually belonged to mine workers. And part of the reasons why they choose to breed them in Rustenburg was simply because they can learn from the white farmers. Not only that, but also there's value to a well-fed cow in terms of sales when you need to sell. But also there are also bragging rights when you must now, because at the end of it, when a mine worker gets to a certain number of cattle, they do what? Like the money, they remit, these cows to home. So you will find that guys who live along the R61, Bizana, Flagstaff, Lusikisiki, and Port St. John's will use one hired truck from Rustenburg, and it will be depositing, these cattle on different stops along the R61, right? So there is this ina-ethe, Andres, or this reciprocity and union it qualifies as what we would call as new forms of migrant cultures in Rustenburg, because it moves away from the traditional cultures of brewing in Mpondo in the hostel spaces. There are other new forms of migrant cultures that happen there, and one of the cultures is cooperating through one crowd, because you will find a kraal of Mpondo as a Kalkeni. You will find a kraal of Mpondo as a Nyandeni. You will find a kraal of Amabumvana. All those segmentations are not based on the fact that we come from different traditional or cultural groups, but it's based on the convenience of transportation when it is actually time to remit. And when all these cattle actually become, when these men now retire, the benefit is that with all the expertise that they would have learned from local farmers and white farmers in Rustenburg, when they do then go back, they are able to implement and continue with the sort of breeding, still earning them a similar amount of value of this cattle.
Thanks for that fascinating stuff. I want to start introducing questions from the chat function, Sandla. So it's kind of, they've been coming really fast and some really interesting questions. I'm just going to, as I noted them, I'm going to raise some of the issues. Tumi Malope from Stellenbosch University raised the issue of the contract workers, and are the contract workers also migrant workers? Do you have a sense of where the contract workers come from? Do they come from these same communities, or are we? To me, I'm kind of basking now along with your question. Are the migrant workers more, say, from Mozambique or Lesotho, or what is going? Did you get from your research get a sense about what is going on with the differences between the sort of permanent workers and contract workers?
Okay. Look, I mean, I think I need to also first, from Dumi's question, identify that because I was using snowball sampling as a method and approach, most of my work led me through people from Mpondoland. Because first, one of the things that I did when I first got to Sondela and Kaneng, the first things I did was to identify Mpondo people, so that they could live. Yes.
Sorry, Sandra, just to interrupt. Those who are not familiar with Rustenburg, Sondela and Nkaneng are informal settlements from which a lot of the workers who were at the Marikana strike, they live in these informal settlements. So that's the significance of that. Sorry, yes. I just wanted to.
No, thanks, Andres. So my work led me to them. And yes, there is a good number of contract workers that are migrants from Mpondoland. Most contracted workers, Andres, that are not from Rustenburg actually do not partake in mining activities. They do other works such as electricians, welding, and so on and so forth. But a good number of them are from those that are contracted migrants. A good number of them are from Mpondoland, because I think one interesting factor that I think even Gavin Hartford would possibly, have something to say about is the mere fact that predominantly mining work is still performed by historically people from Mpondoland. In Sondela, my discovery was that yes, there are Basotho who still perform mine work, but it cannot be compared, to past regimes where the Basotho at some point actually comprised a bigger number. My finding amongst people from Mozambique was that predominantly they had taken up, a much more entrepreneurial space up in Sondela as welders and as traders on the streets. But I cannot, negate the fact and the possibility that there is still maybe not so much good number of them working underground, but my findings were such that these men had now resorted to much more entrepreneurial activities.
Thank you. You mentioned Gavin Hartford. Gavin asked a question in the chat function around the second partners, the second female partners that a lot of the mine workers have in Rustenburg itself. People use the word ina-ethe there. Sanda Benya has also written about this in her article, Women of Marikana. Do you want to, is that how do you factor that into your argument?
Okay. Look, I think, Gavin and I once had a conversation about this when he had contacted me for something. And generally, I don't subscribe to the notion of ina-ethe, because in most instances, people tend to suggest that these are second wives. But there are many Mpondo people here whom I know I have locked on. And I think there's an appreciation of what we call amatikazi in the Eastern Cape, right? And look, I think because my focus was not on those people, on that group of people, I didn't speak much to that on my work, but I did have an appreciation as a person who was conducting ethnographic work that these women were there. These women were there and performing social reproductive work, for these men, as highlighted on Asanda Benya's work on women in the mine, around women in the mines or in the mining areas. But there isn't much really, Andrews, that I can speak to, because it's not something that I delve into, but I do appreciate their presence and their contribution really into the migrant space, and questions of ina-ethe reciprocities that happen around the mines, because these young men and others who have been there for some time actually do benefit from these partners, in the sense that while the man works the mine and comes back home much later or very early in the morning, they are provided for in one way or the other, and so on and so forth.
Thanks. You're keeping it diplomatic. There's I can see Gavin wants to switch on his microphone, and but we could I want to move on to Yamkela Ghini's question from Sonke Gender. It was posted by Sonke Gender Justice, and
it's from Rhodes. It's from Rhodes.
From Rhodes, okay.
Yes.
And raises the question around TB and silicosis. Yes. And the kind of displacement of the burden of dealing with that disease, those diseases caused by the mining industry onto communities. Do you want to say anything about this? I mean, what would your research say about this historical question around the displacement of dealing with disease onto sending communities?
Look, I'm fortunate to be privy to something that's currently happening between Nelson Mandela University and Walter Sisulu University, and it's hosted, as well as WITS, which is hosted, I think, at Nelson Mandela University, around how how the migrant labor system is dealing with that question. There are some, what would we call them? There are some. There's a project, that is being led from the health sciences department here that seeks to deal with that question. But again, I caution around speaking to things that I did not delve into. But there is some show of hand from the side of government and industry, on how to deal with the health question and the consequences of having worked in the mines. I do know in my study that one of the people that I actually spoke to, or whose wives I actually spoke to, actually passed away from silicosis just after I'd completed, doing my fieldwork. So these are things that are there, Yamkela, and I do think in one way or the other, the government is trying to deal with those questions. But I do think it's something that, some colleagues like Bitso from Forte, have tried to deal with in their own work. But it's not something that I specifically, speak to. So I'd like to leave it at that point, and employ a bit of diplomacy before,
On the question of policy, Sandla Velisibuhle Bhuti asked the question about, if you had to advise government on the basis of your findings, what would be the policy implications? He mentions specifically cabinets and the Department of Employment and Labor. So that's one question. It's a big question, but what would be some of the entry points, he asks, that you would want policymakers to look at? He asks a second question about, do you think that your analysis could be also expanded to other SADC countries, Lesotho, Mozambique, Swaziland, where migrant workers come from? Or is there something unique in Mpondoland so they two big questions, maybe a response to that.
Okay, look, I think at a policy level, there would need to be an appreciation, first of all, that migrant labor is not going anywhere anytime soon, contrary to what some of our colleagues have said. But I think also from a policy point of view, there would need to be an acknowledgement of saying, there needs to be a way, of dealing with the questions of housing around, in and around the mines. And I think there would be a need to move away from the thinking that men from Mpondoland have intentions of staying in Rustenburg. It is not true. It's actually very false. Mpondo men and Xhosa men in general, and women, I would even claim, identify with their places of birth as home. And hence, predominantly in my work, I use settling in Rustenburg, because it's just only for a moment. So I think we really need to look at, and also there's also a need to think about how can what would need to be done with the reality that the new generation of mine workers are very interested in going home as frequent as possible. I know countries like Canada, and you correct me here, for mines in that area, there's a so-called fly-in, fly-out method that is employed to ensure that mine workers move in between these spaces as frequent as possible, in between their homes, oscillate between their homes and the mine as frequent as possible. So there's a need to look at questions of transportation. If needs be, there's a need to look around the questions of housing, and really how, you know, the mining industry in collaboration with government can respond to this major discontinuity of squalid conditions around, you know, of communities around the mines, you know, because it's one discontinuity which I think in some level, to some level, mirrors, you know, compound conditions. It may not be a barricaded, locked up space, but I do think the conditions around the mines, you know, speak, you know, some of the realities that, you know, existed, you know, under the compound systems, which, you know, were since abolished into, you know, much more habitable spaces, such as mine hostels. And I think the migrant experience here, Veli, and I'm not sure if I'll be addressing your question correctly, but we can always take it up at some point, is not, the migrant experience is not unique to migrant workers from Mpondoland or from the Eastern Cape. It's quite similar. From a regulation point of view, I do know that, you know, there's been a major, you know, decrease in terms of labor that comes from outside South Africa, although there's a significant number of migrants from Lesotho. Others from Swaziland and Mozambique, in my opinion, and from what I've read, you know, has declined, you know, considerably. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can talk about it at some point.
Thank you, Sandla. Gavin Hartford, you've asked a number of questions, and they're really interesting ones. I wonder whether you don't want to switch on your microphone and maybe just come in directly. You also raised the point about contract workers doing core functions in the mines.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Andres, and thanks very much for this webinar. It's fascinating. Yeah, just on the contract workers. I mean, I think Sandile is right. You know, that the core function of rock drill operators, those people, primarily 80% of them are coming from Mpondoland, and the other 20% largely Lesotho. And that's still like that today. I mean, and then the contracting function, I mean, there's, you know, I just happened to see this last week, you know, Impala's got 6 of 32,000 that are doing primary core business as regards to blasting or stoping, developing, scraping, etc. So yes, there are a lot of contractors, but you know, some are cleaning grass and some are providing non-core services. But there's a big contingent that are providing core business services, and they are also from Mpondoland. And I would go so far as to say that rock drill operating is it's like an unspoken job reservation for Pondos only. No self-respecting Bafokeng person will go and start being a rock drill operator. This is hard work, eh? So it's like accepted by everybody. This is what the Pondos do for us. It's changing a little bit in Rustenburg, I think, but it's basically a Mpondo job. But my questions, Sandile, were really around, you know, I know we don't want to talk about second wives and whatever, but they're a factor. They exist. You can go to those shacks. I was there last week. They're there. And they're a cost to the miner. He funds it primarily. So I'm interested, and that's our raise. What is happening in remittances? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it flatlining post the strike or the 6-month strike of 2014? I hear this very lovely story, and it's a fantastic story for a South African because, you know, prior to the Marikana strike in 2012, in fact, in 2011, I was in Mpondoland because I'm married to a Mpondo. And I was standing on the hills on the Port St. John side. And they would look around with the medalas, and they would show that the houses on the hills that you can see, the ones with zinc and concrete bricks, those are the houses of public servants. But the ones that are in mud and thatch and bamboo, those are the miners' houses. And it was as visible as that basically then, I'm talking of 2010, 2012, that they were telling a story of deep poverty despite being migrant workers and despite having jobs, relative to the public servants who have fixed jobs, good benefits, never get dismissed, and are highly well paid relative to miners. So if that's shifting, I'm looking forward to going back to Mpondoland. I've just been locked down, but it's very good to hear. And I raised a question about ina-ethes because back then, if we're talking about this patriarchy and gender issues, back then, Mpondo people would tell me that a new feature arose, which is that husbands kill wives. That's how they put it. Husbands kill wives. It's never happened in Mpondoland before. And why are they killing wives? They're killing wives because when the man is away working on the platinum belt or wherever, the wife crosses the floor and goes to hook up with a public servant. Because the public servant is a reliable job and is a good income and a good house and. And when they come home, husbands kill wives. Now, I think it's important to, whether that's true or not, that's what I was told. I didn't do a sociological deep down study and database or anything like that. This is just like speaking to people. If that's shifting and there's a new relationship or a new spirit of ina-ethe as between wives on the platinum belt and wives on the, I think it's worth exploring, and that's why I asked that question. And then the last thing I raised is, you know, one of the features that miners will tell you about repeatedly, employers as well, is that migrants go home less. You know, every worker in the mining industry has 1 month's paid leave per year. In addition, they have the 12 public holidays and. So traditionally, you know, Easter's and Christmas to New Year period was a time when the mine shut down during that period, and people go home. But the feature that I keep hearing about is that workers are staying back to earn more money. So I think, you know, understanding the pattern of movement, they're staying back to earn more money because they've got more mouths to feed, more people to look after. So understanding that pattern of movement of mine workers, is that true? Is it the case that they are staying back and they're working during their annual leave or not? I think it's important to understand how sustainable this whole thing is around the growth and development, if you like, consumer spending in the homestead areas. And then lastly, you know, the product of the 6-month strike was that there was a deal, and a good wage increase that Sandili mentioned. What people don't talk about is how that was structured. In fact, what they did is that they gave 1,000 rand repeatedly over 3 years to get to the magical 12,500 rand mark, but they didn't index it to the benefit package. It was a cash, which is in your pay every month. But what it meant is that your retirement benefits, your health benefits, all your insured benefits, basically flatlined for 3 years, and the employers got a massive saving. Because those deals are for 3 years. And the cost of those things keep going up. So yes, we had more disposable income. And that might have meant I could buy a flat screen TV or add a room or a JoJo tank. Or maybe even a car, Sandili says. But at what cost socially, downstream? Or are we saying that the cattle now must be the retirement fund? Because the retirement income package has been decimated by wage deals that don't adjust the retirement to keep up with inflation even. So I think that that's an important thing to not just look at physically what we can see, but actually what the impact of that is in terms of particularly insured benefits, particularly in a country like ours, which could scarcely afford to do a basic income grant, struggling to make that happen, let alone cover the retirement needs of our working population. Thanks, guys.
Gavin, thank you very much. Sandla, just in the interest of timekeeping, will you keep your response to roughly 4 minutes or so? We still want Christy to have the last word. Gavin, thank you. Those were really, really interesting points, and I think some of them would make really great further research projects as well. But Sandla, over to you if you sort of wrap up as well, and then over to Christy van der Westhuizen to conclude the seminar.
Thank you very much, Gavin. That is very insightful. And I think I might have seen something there about us exchanging contacts. That would be lovely. First and foremost, I think, Gavin, I must strongly disagree with the question of wives. I do not welcome that. And this is why. The notion of a wife means umfaz, right? In isiXhosa. And a wife in Mpondoland must have been paid ilobola for, and must have been tailored inyongo on the head, must pop oil on your head to certify you as a wife. Traditionally, and you must have been approved in the homestead that we are taking Umafago as one of our own, and we're acknowledging her family. So for me, that is where the problem comes in referring to those people as wives. Because once you are not acknowledged in Mpondoland as a wife, you are not a wife. What you are to this man in Rustenburg is itikasi, right? Which loosely translates to Nyatsi in what has been explained at length. And I think some of the work by Nelus Nkomo on Rustenburg, elaborates on this, right? And I think next point you made, Gavin, about the houses. Around the question of housing, I think it's very important, and maybe this is something that I didn't clarify on my part. There are differences on how older men in the mines, I'm talking about men here who are in their late 50s and about to exit, on how they deal with this question of remittances, right? And the questions of the location of the household in itself. Younger mine workers, whom I will declare constitute a large component of my participants, have moved away from deep rural areas marked by rondavels and mud houses, closer to the R61, which cuts across all the way from Umtata to Bizana, because they want to move away from, traditional living conditions in areas where there isn't electricity and I think that's, and of course this takes nothing away from what you are saying you might have witnessed some time ago. There are those, yes, who still mirror the conditions of the past. Hence, even this notion of ina-ethe, which I speak to, I highlight quite strongly about continuities and discontinuities. And on the question of how does that, how does the question of Nyatis or Amatikazi in Rustenburg affect remittances? In one of the cases that in one of the homes where I went, there was a situation where I spoke to one of the participants who said her remittances have decreased immensely. And she didn't know why, but suspected that there was another woman in Rustenburg. And I think towards the end of 2018, this man passed away, the man that passed away from silicosis. And this lady then called me to say, son, please do help me with arranging issues around this man's ID. It's missing. We don't have his ID, his wallet and bank cards and so on and so forth. We need you to assist us find what has happened to them. It is later then, Gavin, that we discovered through actually browsing through the late migrant worker's phone that there was a person who was labeled baby, right? And then at some point, then we then called this woman and discovered that she actually was a partner to the migrant and held all the, the banking cards and other issues. So yes, indeed, when we speak of Nyatis or Amatikas, we speak of people that are still there, and the reciprocal relationships between the migrant workers as well as these Nyatis, it does affect remittances if the case of this particular household is anything to go by. And I am sure, because I also lived predominantly around men in Rustenburg, and I did see younger men, married and unmarried, exchanging financial incentives with these women. So it is a thing, but where we do not agree is that these people are wives. Okay, I will skip the question of wives who then cross floors. The statement around wives who cross floors and then meet with professionals and for romantic reasons. It is something that happens, and I think it even happens outside the context of the mining industry when the partner is not, when another partner is not around. So it is something that it does happen. And I think you raise an important a question around the structure of the 2014 agreement and the consequences of it thereof, and how this inadvertently plays out, for pensions and so on and so forth. And I do think, as Andrew says, it really does call for people to look into those kinds of research, and it's certainly something that I'd be happy with any colleague who's here to take it further. Thank you so much.
Christy, over to you. I think you also made a point in the comments around patriarchy and violence, and
well, just to alert us all that if people want to seek another relationship with another person, that definitely does not justify femicide. So I think I want to sort of stating the obvious here, but I'm sure you're all on the same page with this. So I want to really thank Dr. Sandla Nombete and Professor Andries Besuidenhout for joining us today to talk about this really fascinating research that Sandla has been doing. He's just achieved his doctorate on the basis of this research. So many congratulations to you, Sandla, on that achievement. And of course, as a feminist, I would say a very necessary analytical gendering here that's happening, of understanding power relations, beyond narrow, what Andres was talking about earlier on, narrow kind of structuralist Marxist understandings. As feminists, of course, we would have always argued that gender lens would have been necessary from the very start. But it shows you the kind of richness that can be brought to bear when you actually bring gender in as a lens, so that you can understand power in its full complexity and not reduce it to only certain relations. So yeah, I think this is really fascinating work. Many interesting new concepts as well. And I know that Nelson Mandela University, we are particularly interested in a sense, rethinking also through a decolonizing lens. So I think the concept of ina-ethe in this case is definitely something that's going to be able to be taken forward also for further rich work. Sandla, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm also definitely looking forward to a publication. I'm hoping we can see a monograph coming out of this. That would be really great stuff. So, but yeah, thanks a lot to both of you. This is a wonderful conversation, and the fact that you kept our participants riveted. We over 40 people still. Just shows you how that this work packs a punch. So yeah, thanks a lot for that, and thank you to everybody for joining us today and for your questions and interactions. But very much appreciated. If you want to revisit, you can see this on our YouTube channel. CANRAD Advanced Non-Racialism and Democracy, it's called, and then also like us on Facebook, because this video is also lodged there. So if you want to go and have another look and catch up again with something that you might have missed. Right, thank you again, and goodbye to everybody.
Thanks, Christy, much appreciated.